Hi, everybody, and welcome back to a culturally intelligent conversation on race, belonging, and empathy. I want to say hello to our panelists, Nicole Cottrell, Mike Barnet, Christine Anderson, Dr. Josiah Igono, Candice Tolliver, and Earl Lee. I'm Renee Veronica Klug, and I want to say thank you so much for your feedback in part one of our conversation. And today, as we move forward, I invite you to get to know who our panelists are by watching that video, which I will link to below here. Last week, they did share with you their narratives, their experiences about being Black in the US, and what they thought the actual words Black Lives Matter mean. And they also shared their perspectives on belonging as it pertains to the protests. Now, right here, I want to issue an apology because I used the word riot. And riot is not an appropriate term to be using when it comes to what's happening in our world right now and what has been happening for many, many decades. And so in using the word protest, I want to make clear that language does matter. And in looking at something that Austin Channing Brown shared just today on her webcast series, Imagining How Expansive Racial Justice Can Be, it's called The Next Question, she included a quote by John W. Franklin, who in 1921 had this to say regarding the Tulsa Massacre. So if you have not heard about that or Black Wall Street, please look it up. Franklin said, the term riot is contentious because it assumes that Black people started the violence as they were accused of doing by the whites. We increasingly use the term massacre. And so we're all still learning. I do this for a living, and yet I'm still learning. We make mistakes and we own them. And that's what today's conversation is about. It's about moving into the spaces of empathy, learning how not to just not be a racist, but how to move into the work of anti-racism. And so in foregrounding this conversation, I want to share a few definitions. As we look at empathy, this is a person's ability to adopt the perspective and experience the emotions of another person. So sympathy is we feel sorry, empathy is we actually feel what that person feels, and it's perspective taking. But compassion, the way I see it, is empathy in action. It extends the viewpoints and the feelings contained in empathy to include the desire to help. Other theorists call it radical empathy. It's the behavioral change that we all need in order to make a difference. Now, as we move forward into our first question, I want to make very clear that my value system is that any marginalized community, whether it's people of color in general, whether it's women, or right here, the Black community, I do not believe that it is our responsibility to educate the masses when they don't know something. Some of us as educators have taken upon ourselves that responsibility. So I want to make that clear. And at the same time, I want to say thank you to these panelists who have opened themselves up, who have made themselves vulnerable and transparent to be able to say, they're not necessarily providing an education, although they are providing of their life experiences. And we welcome that and we celebrate that. And so in moving into this first question, how do people develop empathy, or why should they develop empathy? I am going to go ahead and start with Mike Barnet. So.
Yeah, great. You know, when I think about how to develop empathy, I think there's three components to it, especially as it relates to like maybe creating racial empathy. And I would say the first part of it would be to be really willing to listen, and to listen and being processed what's being said, and don't try to immediately have like a counter argument or something that's going to justify your point of view. It's just really important to listen. Once you really heard that person, hopefully that'll lead to the next component, which I would say is understanding. and being able to live in the experience and comprehend its severity. So like you will listen, which hopefully leads to understanding, which will lead to, I guess, connection. And I think connection is going to give birth to compassion and sympathy and ultimately empathy. Empathy for that person's experience. But yeah, those are my thoughts on developing empathy. Trademarked. No, I'm kidding. Does that make sense though? Great.
I really love what Mike was saying about listening. And I know that we have this on a recording, so I want to go back because he was like listening, understanding, connection, and then connection gives birth to, I think you said action, I can't remember. But listening is something that was really resonating with me, thinking about empathy and in the way of storytelling, very similar to even what we're doing right here. And for some of those of you who have watched and have heard stories, which has helped to develop empathy. And I think when we listen to the stories of other people, we humanize them. And I really think that a lot of the work that we see when people are combative or they try to have a counter argument, it's because they don't see that individual as a human. They don't see them as someone's son, someone's father, someone's uncle, someone's aunt, someone who has children, somebody who likes to go and dance, like certain types of food. And as human beings, we are so diverse. We bring so much to the table. And I think that the way that we learn that is by listening. We have a conversation, we get to know who they are. And it grows this connection so that when that person is in pain or when they are hurting or when their community is hurting, then we also hurt because now we are connected to them. And I think that storytelling, listening to the stories of others is one way to develop empathy.
Yeah, I really like that word listening that both of you have used now. I think it's easy for anyone to make generalizations about people they do not know. So if we have no way of relating, no relationship, it's much easier for us to make generalized statements about a group of people versus if we know individuals within that group, our ability to make those generalized statements is reduced. And that's science. So my inner brain nerd is coming out right now, thinking about that whole curiosity and fostering just a desire to know about the other person's experience. What is it like for you? What is it like in your world? What is it that makes you tick? And then combining that with the ability to actually hear what they say without, as Mike said, immediately coming up with a narrative for, well, it was just because, or without having to clarify or justify their story, allowing people to tell, like Candice said, tell their story. That's a work that happens in our minds, everybody's individual mind. And if we can't open that, we cannot open this conversation. So I'm encouraged that minds are opening right now. There's curiosity being developed. There's a desire to know. And until you know, you can't possibly understand.
I'd even add to what Mike, Candice, and Christine have said about listening and knowing. I think it's also a matter of how do we listen in a non-judgmental way, so we're able to develop authentic connections with others and also ourselves. Because I think it's not just I hear you, I'm listening, because sometimes people are listening, but I need you to also hear the experience that I'm sharing, because that is my experience and my authentic experience. I think sometimes we struggle with bringing authenticity into spaces. And so I think that's also kind of a double-edged sword too, because you can be authentic and sometimes what people call too authentic, and it can backfire on you because you don't know who you're going into a space with. And so you show up as being authentic, and then the person that you're in the space with is not very good at receiving that. And I think that's where the radical empathy comes in, because you, as on the other side of it, needs to also recognize the authenticity that someone is showing up with. And I'll give a brief example. When I go to an interview for a job, and what you see on the first day is the exact same thing. Like, I don't, and Renee knows about me, I don't do mute colors. My colors are always bright. Again, the only dark things I own in colors are probably ASU gear, or work shirts. Bright colors. I love a good bow tie. Like, I'm coming with my big personality. And those are the things that you're gonna get. And you're gonna get the raw me. You're gonna get the unfiltered version. And sometimes not everybody in the workplace, for example, likes that, because they think you have to curate a professional you. And I'm a big believer of like that is determined by a white perspective. The professional me was determined by somebody who doesn't look like me, trying to tell me. That's why we tell Black women to straighten their hair, to look professional, right? And men have to wear suits and ties because that's what was told to us. What happens when you can't afford to do those things?
Or what happens if your hair doesn't grow out of your head straight? You know what I'm saying?
I'll jump in real quick. I love the topic of listening. Listening. One of my mentors told me a long time ago, and it's always stuck with me. He said a listening ear has a healing quality, and you know sometimes the greatest gift that you give someone is to just listen. And if you don't know what to do, if you listen long enough, you'll know exactly what to do next. And yeah, I concur with you, Mike, and everyone who has spoken, that listening is the number one thing. And to be clear, there is a difference between hearing and listening. Um, our brain takes in billions of bits of information per second. And if we were to pay attention to all bits of information, we would literally explode. So our brain protects us from the things that are, you know, unnecessary, like alarm clocks or sirens, you know, 10 miles away, or, our kids in the other room. Like, we have this way of protecting us from information or things, sounds that we don't necessarily need to hear. But listening, on the other hand, is a cerebral activity. It's this cerebral right for comprehension. And like Mike said, you know, it entails understanding. And once you understand something, you are more informed and better equipped to enter into that thing. And when you talk about empathy, empathy always involves sharing, always. I must give of myself. And as you give of yourself, I understand, can empathize better and more deeply. True empathy always involves a sharing component. And it's funny because in the world of performance, that is actually one of the words that has been equated to higher levels of performance, is the word share. And if we are good at sharing, if we are good at listening, Renee, what you alluded to earlier in terms of compassion, that becomes a reality, right? And at the end of the day, listening is a skill. It is a skill. You have to have, skills to be able to listen and to repeat back and say, what I hear you saying is this. Yes, okay, you listened. You truly listened. You didn't just hear this, pardon the term here, no pun intended. You didn't just hear the white noise. You actually listened to me. And so ultimately lead into action. I love the acronym ACT, action changes things. We can speak all day, We can listen all day, but if it doesn't, translate into action, then what are we doing?
I'm just gonna jump on what Josiah just talked about with ACT. Action changes all things. So the realm I live in is in academia, higher education, and there's lots of statements right now being put out by presidents of universities and deans and everybody about how do we, we're going to move forward in racial justice and Black Lives Matter. And again, I've read a lot of them, not just the ones here at the university I work at, but other schools as well. And I think what I'm also hearing a lot from people is, where's the action? Where's the act? And I think, to me, that is what Josiah is talking about is, and what we're all talking about is, there needs to be an action. There needs to be action being taken, and not just people being, oh, we hear you. Yeah, Black Lives Matter, or racial justice and anti-racism. And I know we're going to talk about that later. But we're not just. It's not lip service. It's about how do you then put pen to paper and create a plan to make change. And sometimes that means also doing that on an individual level. How are you as a person going to think about the actions that you take and how they're going to make change? So, I love that acronym of ACT. I probably will inscribe that in a photo of some sort in a painting and put it above my bed. So, as a reminder that we should get up every morning willing to take action, willing to act accordingly to make a change.
I'm going to jump in. I love what everyone has shared in terms of building empathy. I agree very much with the listening and action. I tend to want to take action first. That's part of my personality. I want to respond by doing. And it's my hang up sometimes is with people who want to be more measured at times. I want to be prayerful, but I also know that there's a time to act. So I personally believe that we're in that time, but we have to also wait for other people we have to offer the grace for people that are just now beginning this experience and having this conversation and asking questions. But I think when I think about empathy and the things that have grown me the most personally, a lot of times has been the things that have made me uncomfortable. I think that you begin to really grow in empathy when you're allowed, given permission, and put yourself in a place to feel uncomfortable. One example that comes to my mind is we've taken our children to Puerto Peñasco, Mexico, from Phoenix, where we live, to build houses with an organization called One Mission that we really have supported for years. And, it was uncomfortable to be there, to be in the barrio, to be with families that are doing everything they can to get by day by day. And it's still not enough. And my children coming to me and saying, there's trash in their yard. There's just trash. And me having to explain that that's what life is like in the barrio. And so the discomfort that even created in my children, for them to recognize that that's not okay, that is the stuff that puts a fire in people's belly. I think my kids have grown in empathy because of that experience. They were introduced to a different culture and the beautiful people there in a way that I couldn't replicate for them on my own, right? And so I'm not saying we all have to try and put ourselves in those positions, but if we can even be creative in how we think about stretching outside of what is our comfort level, our safety, our bubble. And that could actually be as simple as you speaking to people that don't look like you, starting conversations with people that don't look like you. Because I know that a lot of people right now in America do not have friends, are not friends with anyone who is a person of color. And that sounds like a small thing. I think to some people it's an obvious, but for a lot of people it's not. And it is uncomfortable. And we can't even begin the listening portion that we're talking about if we aren't, for a lot of people, willing to get out of our comfort zone.
I think that comfort, that is a big part. When you were explaining how, you know, you're there and it's uncomfortable, I think a lot of times as human beings, we run away from the uncomfortable. I mean, whether it's a rock in our shoe or, you know, just anything that kind of causes a little discomfort, our usual like reaction is get this off of me, get this out of me, get me out of this place, get me away from here. And when I think about, you know, racism, when I think about just every atrocity that is occurring, that has occurred, that, you know, that we're dealing with, it's like, it should be uncomfortable. You know, when having conversations about racism and having conversations about, you know, George Floyd and, you know, every other hashtag that has had to be created, like every single time we should be uncomfortable. It should feel so uncomfortable and uneasy to talk about the racism that people are experiencing, the systemic racism that we live inside. It should make us uncomfortable. There should never be a point where we feel comfortable, you know, because it's in that uncomfortability, like Nicole's saying, that's what lights the fire. It's in that uncomfortability where we start having the conversations and start thinking about what does it mean to take action here? Because this is uncomfortable and it's not okay. And if it's uncomfortable for me, and, you know, it can be any kind of situation that maybe you're not directly involved in, but if just talking about it makes you feel uncomfortable, then I think that should help you set into that empathy part of like, wow, like I'm only talking about this. I wonder what this is like for the person who is experiencing it. Because I don't live in the barrio, right? That's in Puerto Peñasco. But if I'm there and I'm like, this is crazy, like this makes me feel uncomfortable, instead of running, right? Instead of being like, whoa, I'm so glad we get to go back home, you know? It's saying like, wow, okay, now like what's next? How do I eradicate this? And so I think that piece is so huge, because you can't, in my opinion, have true empathy until you have sat with, made the decision, like Nicole had said, and then sat in that and listened to someone else. And it humanizes us. You know, it humanizes the condition that we're talking about. I remember I did a storytelling show that's called The Whole Story. It's held here in Phoenix. My friend Rachel Egborough is the curator and creator. And there was a woman who told a story, and I want to say maybe a year after that, she had passed away. My mom was watching the news and she was like, that background looks familiar. And I saw it, and I saw the woman, and I wept, like I cried. I did not know this woman. The only thing that I knew is that I went to a storytelling show and heard her tell a story that was her own personal experience. And from that one story that was about 7 minutes long, I didn't even talk to her after the show. There was no other interaction. One story that was 7 minutes, finding out that she had passed away felt like a friend, felt like someone close to me. And I felt, you know, enraged in how she had passed away and needing to know like what happened and what are they doing to figure out what happened. And so humanizing that which has been dehumanized, I think, is another helpful way for us to settle into this work of what does it mean to empathize with others.
One of my favorite neuroscientists said something that struck me, and it kind of encompasses everything that we're talking about when it comes to being uncomfortable. He said, being uncomfortable or discomfort corrects a tendency for self-centered perceptions of other people's pain. And I cannot say it better. That is exactly what discomfort does. And that's exactly why we've all made the point that we have to get uncomfortable before this changes. It's because it helps correct that tendency to sit in our comfort zone and not focus on our perception of our incorrect perception of other people's pain.
And I mean, that's where growth happens too, right? You know, growth happens when you're in that uncomfortable space. You know, when you're in your comfort zone, there's no growth. And so, you know, there's conversation around the growth mindset, right? And the fixed mindset. And so if you want to be in a space where you're growing, and this doesn't have to be talking about growing as a professional, it's growing as a human being. Like, how are you stretching your imagination, your mind, your ideas, your thoughts? How and the purpose of that is to develop a better system, a better society, and you know, civics, for example. And I'm not sure what it's like here in the United States. But I've heard from others that it's not something that's taught as often in every school as it was back, you know, back in the heyday. But you know, in Jamaica, that's a top, like social studies is like you take that class, like, and that's our version of our civic. Like, you take that class, even right up until you graduate, like you can take it. And it's just like, I think, how do we even get back into the mindset of teaching civics? And because it's a very powerful tool. I was on a phone call, this webinar earlier today with a couple higher education presidents of universities, and they were talking about where the intersection of the liberal arts and technology and post-COVID, and one of the individuals was a president of a small traditional, what we call traditional liberal arts institution, and her take on it was like, people are coming to their institution to learn how to infuse these like liberal arts, like traditional values into technology. And she talked about one alumni who owns 15% of the internet. Don't know how you do that, but that's what they do. Like, who was a philosophy major, a writing major in college, and a computer science minor, right? And how, like, he's talking about how he infuses the liberal arts values into his work. And as a product of two liberal arts institutions, like, to me, that is important for us to remember that, like, some of those values of like of understanding history, like understanding the art of public speaking, the art of making an argument, take a sociology class, like, those are ways that you can also work on developing radical empathy, because it's learning done simpler. You know, like, it's just, it seems very simple, and to me a very mundane thing to think about, like, when you're told that you have to do these core curriculum in college, and people like are like, why do I have to do core? I'm only here to study computer science or business. That is the reason why. The reason why is that these courses, these liberal arts courses, the core courses, help to keep you grounded and help you recognize some of the ethics and the moral issues surrounding the work that you're going to do, but also the person that you're going to become.
Thank you. That was beautiful. And I hope people are listening. I hope people learn to, like Mike said, not have a canned answer ready. Don't start charging, you know, like, I don't know what it's called. You know, you like backload what you think about before you say it, and then moving to the next question. I want to talk about something that I believe Christine and Candice brought up in part 1, which was talking about implicit bias and microaggressions. And these words and terminologies are used a lot, but what do they mean? Implicit bias can also be called unconscious bias, because these are the attitudes or the stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, and our decisions in an unconscious manner. And they can encompass both favorable and unfavorable assessments. They're activated involuntarily and without an individual's awareness or intentional control. So when it comes to being favorable, let's say, and I've had a student say this, she said to me once, well, I like dating guys from X culture because I know that our kids are going to be cute. All right, so that's a favorable assumption, but it is an assumption because how do you know your kids are going to be cute anyway? You know, that's being real, but also just this idea, I know, but just this idea that, that only this group could yield this result, this intended result. And the big part of implicit bias is that whatever opinion you hold, whether it's positive or negative, is that it's to the exclusion of others, right? That's really important. And why does this matter? Because we have to own our privilege. So whether we are not people of color, whether we are not the predominant gender, or even identify with any of our identifications, whether we are not a member of the predominant religion. There is an activity where you essentially write many parts of your identity. I think it's called flower power. It's on different petals of a flower. And then you begin to pluck off those pieces of the flower that are not representative of whatever the power structure is that's most predominant in the culture that you live in. Because remember, power can shift depending on where you go. A Catholic might be in tremendous power in one nation and not necessarily in another. And so sometimes, specifically in the United States, you see the one with the most intact power would be the cisgender white male. All right, and why does that matter when it comes to the topic of anti-racism? Because policy is impacted by implicit bias. Implicit bias can be, I'm not gonna live in that neighborhood because it's the hood, it's the barrio, it's the whatever. And then you migrate to a particular neighborhood to the exclusion of the other, and your money and your politics goes with it. So in talking about implicit bias, which we need to be aware of, and I can provide resources on that as well, come with it microaggressions. And according to Pierce, these are the relatively slight, subtle, and often unintentional offenses that cause harm. Gloria Ladson-Billings calls microaggressions 1,000 daily cuts. So what are these? These are, oh, you don't sound Black. Oh, you're really smart for a woman. Oh, you don't act that gay. All right. And this is to say that you had an assumption in mind of what smartness or what a particular culture looks like. And this person defies that. Why? Because you're not actually looking at the person, you're looking at the identity, the identifying label. They're important, as Nicole said last week, we look at color. Color isn't the only identifying factor, but we look at it. Now, in moving to anti-racism, this is the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, organizational structures, policies and practices and attitudes, as you were alluding to before when we talked about empathy, so that power is redistributed and shared equitably, keeping in mind that equity is not the same as equality. You can treat everybody equally. You can tell everybody, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. But if not everybody has boots, as Martin Luther King said, then not everybody can pull themselves up by those bootstraps. So equality does not equal equity. Ibram X. Kendi, who Nicole also brought up last week in How to Be an Anti-Racist, says this: to be anti-racist is to deracialize behavior, to remove the tattooed stereotype from every racialized body. Behavior is something humans do, not races do. So racist. So Black people don't act a certain way. People act a certain way depending on their personality. Finally, Austin Channing Brown in yesterday's Unlocking Us podcast with Brene Brown, yesterday was June 10th, 2020, she said this: the work of anti-racism is becoming a better human for other humans. So, that was a lot of front loading, but I hope it was helpful. And the question now is that people claim often that they're not racist, but what is the work of anti-racism? And we recognize here that race is a construct, but racism is a systemic issue. So do what you will with this question. What is the work of anti-racism?
I would say it's directly confronting racist or systematic like racial racist policies or actions that affect, in particular, our nation here in America, whether that be from policing to housing to social events. I know that I feel like anti-racism is a relatively new term to the general public, and I think although it kind of makes sense when you say it what it is, I think I have sympathy for those who have been in power so long. How do you adjust it? Like, so you've had this certain advantage for so long. How do you even see the advantages that you have to address them? And I don't necessarily have the answers per se, but I know it's at least a good start to like start realizing, yes, these systems have been in place and it's time for us to address them. And I think maybe that's just how you start being an anti-racist, just by recognizing, hey, these systems are in place that are completely been advantageous for one group and detrimental for others. What do you guys think?
I'm gonna agree with you. You know, like when you were saying that, I literally think work. Like you said, the first thing is to identify like it's happening. And for someone being in power for so long and then having to make that realization, it's work. And then I think the reason why, at the end when you're like, there's so much that's there, I just like, it reminds me of like, if y'all ever had to clean a yard before. Now, mind you, I haven't cleaned a lot of yards, so I don't know a ton about this, but there was one time where it's like, go pick up those weeds, pull those weeds out, right? If you've ever been in that position where you're looking at, and I'm in Arizona, so sometimes like your yard might not, my yard right now has grass, but sometimes it's just dirt and there's weeds and things like that in some areas, right? If you're not taking care of the yard, but like it's work. Like you look out at it and you're like, it could be a laundry pile, like whatever your thing is, that is a lot of work, and you look at it. I feel like when you look at the work of being an anti-racist and looking at anti-racism, it is a lot of work. This is hundreds of years of like, sowing seed, like, and, Josiah brought it up last time, right? That it's just so much that has been cultivated and watered and planted again, generation after generation after generation, into policy after policy after policy, neighborhoods, churches. This is not something that's like, let me just pull up this weed real quick and ta-da, racism is gone. Like that is not what we're dealing with. And it's hard, I think, because there are both, we talked about this also, there is overt racism when we see, videos of lynchings, and then there's covert racism when we look at like education policy, when we look at curriculum that's going into schools, that is Eurocentric curriculum, when we look at, neighborhoods and we look at redlining, like the list goes on and on and on. And so I think like with what Mike is saying, like the first step is to be like, okay, this is real, right? Because for some people it's not real. If you're in a position of power, why does it have to be? Because you're benefiting from it. So you've got to now recognize that it's real, and recognize that knowing that it's real, it's going to cost you. It's going to probably cost wherever you're at in life and how you got there. And I think that for anyone, that's something that's like, oh, wait, You know, it's having that realization that although, you know, the conversation that we have about privilege, although you might have had a hard childhood growing up, if you're white, the color of your skin was not an addition to it being hard. But having that conversation with someone, that's going to be difficult for that kind of like realization to take place. And so when you do that, you know, once you recognize that, you kind of deal with the mourning, I guess, of what this is going to cost you, and then it's time to get to work. But then when you look at the work, you're looking at layer upon layer upon layer of like hard rock, and you got a shovel, you know. But then that's where I think it comes into both sides. Being an anti-racist and being engaging in that work is you as an individual. So looking at myself, looking at my own, you know, implicit bias, looking at the racism that, you know, one has perpetuated, whether they knew or they didn't, which doesn't matter, right? It's there. So there's that part, but then there's the collective part as well. And you need both to do the work, but you cannot do collective work unless the individuals are also committed to doing the work in themselves.
Say it a little bit louder for the folks in the back of the church to hear. So I have a couple of thoughts, and I'm going to try and limit it to like one here and one there so we can keep the conversation moving. Marcus Messiah Garvey, who's a national hero in Jamaica, and many folks know him here in the US as well, has a quote that's, "The tree without roots is like a people without a history." And that's my loose paraphrasing of the exact quote. That quote hangs in my office because there's a constant reminder to me that we need to know our history, and we need to know where we're coming from, especially when we're looking at whether the tree is beautiful or dead. You can decide however you want to see the tree, especially in this current time. Like, depending on who you are, your tree might be looking like it's flourishing. And for some people, the tree is not looking so good. But like going back to what Candice says about like pulling out those weeds, you got to be careful as you're pulling those weeds out, because like you're not sure what's going on under there. And I think it's important for us to recognize that like it's so deeply rooted. Like these roots in these trees are wrapped around everything that we do. And like we have to be careful as we're pulling them out, right? And so like, because like as you pull them out, you might see the education system, you'll see housing, you'll see like you see law enforcement, you see everything coming out. And I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying it needs to happen. Like it just needs to happen. Like it needs to just go ahead and just yank the entire, you can't just sever, you know, the tree is dying. It's literally like, you know, another metaphor, the tree is dying. You're gonna, I'm just gonna cut the top off so people, you know, leave a stump. No, like pull the entire thing out. It needs to be pulled out, and it needs to be then by pulling it out, then you can replant it. Then you can replant it in a way that brings in radical empathy, in a way that is anti-racist, in a way that respects Black and brown bodies. Like to me, that is so, like you have to do that. And that's just where it's like pull the entire tree out. Don't just cut the stump off because the top of the tree looks ugly, you know? Because right now, America is looking like a dying tree. And like, and I'm sorry to say, you know, like it's what it looks like, because a dying tree that's burning, you know, and so it's burned at this point, but like we just need to cut to the entire tree out and start to think about how we approach educational policies that are inclusive. We start thinking about, there's a lot of folks right now talking about defunding the police departments. And, you know, we're not going to get political on this call, but I'm not for that, because like what we need to do is to reimagine what the police departments look like, And what we need to do is train the officers to be better. And that's what we need. When you defund a police department, you have, who's going to protect and serve what they're supposed to be doing. It's taking them back to those roots and saying that your job is to protect and serve this community. And here are the tools we're going to give you to do that. And some of those tools means that we're going to teach you anti-racist ways. And if you can't get on board with that, then you can't sit with us. You got to go. To me, that's what is important and what's needed.
I'm going to jump in here real quick. I think it's beautifully stated by everyone. I believe I want to stick with the tree analogy because this is something that has been on my heart. And when you look at a tree, right? It doesn't. Let's say that you are that proverbial tree. Let's say that the country is the proverbial tree. When you see a tree, and let's say it's an apple tree, the apples, right? Manifestation of what is going on underneath, whether those are exuberant, healthy, bright, or whether they're misshapen, misformed, rotten, what have you. They're the last manifestation, the last thing you see, the last identifier of what is going on underneath. When you start talking about racism and how to fix it, anti-racism, I don't believe that one can solve this problem unless you are talking about the heart, one is talking about roots, or some type of transformation. We cannot have this conversation unless we talk about those things. And so when you look at the proverbial tree, something, the roots that feed the tree, right? The roots that feed the tree. Let's say, let's call this tree you. Those roots consist of actions, reactions, habits, political worldviews, religious worldviews, language. Those roots feed what will eventually become of the fruit that you have. But I don't think that the narrative stops there, because there is something even beneath those roots that feed the roots themselves. The first one is verbal. What did I hear as a child growing up? What did my mom and dad always say? My grandma and grandpa then? What did they always say when I was growing up as a child? What did they say about white people? What did they say about Black people? What did they say about our legislators? That verbal programming has affected and has formed the way that you and I see the world, whether we like it or not. Observational learning, what some people would call modeling. What did we see? What did we see with our own eyes? How did we see our mom respond to the man that didn't look like them? How did our uncles treat other people that didn't look like them? What did we see the police, on television or otherwise locally? How did we see them treat members of the community? How did our coaches treat us? How did our teachers model these things, right? Modeling, observational learning impacts what you and I view as truth or acceptable, right? So those things feed those roots. The other one, and probably the most impactful one, is critical life events. I'm sorry, but if you get beat up by the KKK as a child, you're gonna feel some type of way. If you are the only and some, a group of Black people help you from getting beat up after, and you're a white male, so to speak, you're gonna view Black people differently, right? There are critical life events that happen that change the course of our life. And these things, critical life events, verbal programming, modeling, those things feed the main root system, which is our beliefs, our actions, our reactions, our language, our habits, all of these things, which eventually impacts, guess what? Our fruit. So when you start talking about statistics, when you start talking about what we see on CNN, what we see on Fox, what the president is saying, what this group is saying, we can't have this deep conversation. This is not a drive-by conversation. And as Candice said, it is work. It is work. And guess what? Pull up a chair, because it's going to take a while. This is a mature conversation for people who are ready to work. This conversation about racism is a mature conversation for people who are ready to work, because we are talking about roots here that are deeply embedded, that are tied to other things, that are tied to this thing over here. And oh my goodness, it's tied to this thing. So how do you, because, I won't say that, but if If you want to have something die off, you don't feed it anymore. It is easier to create new habits than it is to get rid of old ones. The answer now is, are those spots, is that verbal programming? Are those things that I, with my eyes as a child in my formative years, are those critical life events, are they serving me right now? Are they adding value to my life and the value of others? If the answer is no, we don't feed it anymore. We don't feed it anymore. And at that point, attacking, we're talking about the heart, and we are setting ourselves up for transformation.
I mean, nobody wants to follow Josiah. So that was, we just got taken to church, and I feel like, I just want to say one, I think, small part of what Josiah was sharing. You know, the word that comes to my mind is repentance. And, you know, whoever ends up listening to this, whatever your background is, you know, maybe you don't have a church background or a Christian faith necessarily, but some people would use other language like explore your own biases or uncover your own biases or address your own bias. For me personally, I'm going to use the word repentance because I believe in the transformation of repentance. And when we're talking about what Josiah is talking about, transformation, real transformation, I believe can come in saying, I didn't know this was wrong. I recognize this is wrong. And I want to now turn and run the opposite direction from this thing. And so however that looks for people, and it can be your own unique process, but I believe very strongly that to address all the things that everyone has so beautifully mentioned, to address the heart, to address the soul, to address the mind, to address the emotions and our past experiences and our family experiences and all the things that we've seen growing up, there will come a point where we have to acknowledge our own bias and potentially repent from that and admit and say, these are the things that I've believed wrongly. And we were mentioning before the call how Ibram Kendi, who wrote Stamped and How to Be an Anti-Racist, that, you know, he's a Black man and he set out to do some research on his own because he actually admitted his own bias in saying he believed, for example, that all Black neighborhoods were dangerous. That wasn't his experience growing up, but he believed that because those stories had been told to him, the media had informed his decisions, that narrative had been, you know, restated again and again. And as he began his research, he realized very quickly that that is of course not true. And he has a kind of mantra that he says, and I love it. He says, the only thing wrong with Black people is that we believe there's something wrong with Black people. That is exposing this bias and saying, I'm willing to lay down the things, the soil that my roots are growing in, to uproot the roots themselves. I'm willing to do that if it's rotten, if it's spoiled, if I've held on to anything that simply is not true. And even taking this step and questioning what is true is so important. So I would just add that piece.
I agree with you, Nicole, on the fact that no one gets a free pass on being able to say, oh, I'm not racist. Nobody gets a free pass. We all have implicit bias. We all have to do the work that Josiah is talking about and that Candice mentioned as well. And for me, putting anti in front of anything automatically implies that there needs to be a conscious, intentional action towards equality and compassion. For instance, when you're talking about anti-racism, there needs to be a conscious and intentional action, not just words, towards equality, compassion, but also against inequality, stereotyping, assumptions, generalizations, some of this deep-rooted things that we've been talking about using the tree analogy. And so I cannot simply say, I am an anti-racist. I must also move and act against racism. I must move and act. I don't get to just say it. And that means I'm intentionally educating myself. I am intentionally teaching against things in my home. We are intentionally teaching against these things in our schools. We are intentionally teaching against these things in our organizations, in our businesses, in our governments. We cannot just say we are anti-racist. We must also do. And so maybe that's that piece, that internal individual work that you guys mentioned, but also the collective work that we've also been talking about as a work that must be done. It has to start inside of us, but then it has to spread to our institutions, our constructs, our cultural understanding. And that point that Josiah made about letting go of things that are not serving us any longer, that is key. It's key. We don't get an excuse anymore. That has to be done. It has to be done, because we're just going to keep perpetuating the same cycle if we keep perpetuating the same mindset. So the work of letting go of that which does not serve must happen on all sides.
So good. Something that came to my mind as the last three, you guys were talking, was that like, it's big work, but it's bigger than us. And I think like that's something that everyone has to remember, that it is hard and it's going to be difficult, and we have to recognize it. And there's going to be sacrifice. There's going to be all of these things. And it's so much bigger than us right now, because I think about history. I think about people who have come before, who have done work before, and we are here now, and we can look back on that. Or even people who are still alive today. Some of you have quoted them, right? You're reading their work that they've done that's inspiring you to do the work that you're doing. And we have littles. Like, this is not just a world that is filled with adults. There are children who are being born in this time. There are teenagers who are, graduating from high school in this time. There are so many people that have to keep on living past this. It includes us. But right now, what an opportunity. I was in a training this today, and they were talking about, what's your intention going in? And one of the core values they have is learning continuously. And so I said, this is going to be what I'm using throughout training, because I like to learn. Learning's fun for me. And I have always gained good things from being someone who is willing to learn something and to be a beginner. And in that, we have an awesome opportunity to look at something that could be an obstacle and a challenge, or something that can't get done, whatever. We get to look at it as an opportunity and say, what an opportunity for us in this day now to have these conversations, for people to have this awakening, for us to say we don't get an excuse, we don't get a cop out, for us to repent, for us to turn away from something. Like, it is an opportunity to create a better world for us, but then also for every young person, every child that is growing up. Like, that to me is amazing. That is being a part of that transformation. And like, if you're telling me, hey, you're doing all this hard work, but your 9-year-old gets to live in a nation that looks a lot better than this, give me the shovels, give me the gloves, bring it on. If you're telling me it's going to be a better world for my high school students that I taught, over 4 years, yes, because I want it so much more than just for me, but I want it for everyone. And that's, I think it ties back to this conversation about empathy. When I look at someone, I see that potential. I see the potential. And then it's asking the question of, how do we make this potential actual? How do we do that? And I think if we could all get that mindset of like, this isn't just about me, but it's about bringing something into the world that's going to increase the quality of life for every single person. Now we are being, we're doing this work of humanity. And I think that is that like glue that can start to bring people together, but it does require that individual recognition to even take the first step. And that's just, I mean, you're talking about roots and the experiences that we have when we're younger and how that shapes us, and some of us kind of push them down, but even when you do that, they still live, they still permeate those places in our lives. You know, you get older and then you realize, like, why do I do this thing? Or you read a book and you're like, you never knew, like, you did this thing because of this experience or this thing that happened, you know? And I've been having conversations this week, something that I shared with the group earlier, with my partner, and he's telling me stuff from when he was younger, experiences with, you know, racism that he experienced as a child, and now as an adult, and he's looking at the world and he's like, I've experienced this stuff has happened, and how that has shaped the different ways that he has seen things. And so I think that for all of us, we can all give an example of something we've experienced as a young child and how that has shaped the decisions that we've made, the relationships that we have pursued or not pursued, the opportunities that we've taken or not taken, the places we have gone or stayed away from. And so that root conversation, I think, is really important. And it's important for all of us to remember, like, it's not even just us at this point. This is something that is for everyone.
And I know we're coming close on time here too, so I want to make this quick. But I think to go back to the earlier question about, like, what does it look like to be anti-racist? I think Christine, like, really hit the nail on the head when she talked about, like, not, like, doing the work. It's, you know, and Josiah talked about acting. I was on a previous conversation where individuals who are white were expressing that they don't know how to and what to do and where to start and what to say. And I think it's just important for them to just, for anyone who's listening, who is in that group and don't know what to do, what to say, and how to change, open your mouth and ask. Like, I really just think that people just need to say, I see this, I recognize this is racism, but I don't know what to do, and I want help. That's, like, you know, like, just recognize that the roots are going bad. You know, recognize that the soil was treated with bad manure. Like, recognize that, like, you didn't get the best soil to plant the seed, and just say, I don't know what to do and I need help, because someone will reach out and help you. And if people are not reaching out and help you, then you need to get some new friends.
Earl, you just answered a question that I was having to myself as I was listening to the responses from you all. And the question I was having in my mind was, what are the actual tactical things that can be done? You know, what are the steps that we can actually take? Because this isn't a new issue. You know, we tend to have tried to tackle racial equality and things like that throughout from the ending of the Civil War, you know, but there's still the systematic racism is still there. And the average person, although they may recognize, hey, there's this systematic racism and I can see it and I can taste it and I can touch it and I don't want it to be there anymore. How do you actually make a real change? And asking a question, like just asking, maybe them asking that question is the start. But I think in my own personal, like, if someone would ask me that, I'd be like, well, just stop being racist, you know, or just stop supporting these systems, right? It's just as simple as that. But it's harder to translate. It's harder to actually implement to end it. And the question is, why is that? We all know it's wrong. I'm almost at the point where it's like, it's not time for repentance. You know it's wrong. It's time for action. You shouldn't have been doing it in the first place. Like, the repentance gives you an out, you know, like, get to doing it. Just stop the action, you know, but it's me. So
I think Mike, you bring up some good points, and if I may, please, because this has been on my heart. This has been on my heart lately. You know, without getting super religious, you know, there is a story in the Bible, and one of the individuals who was to carry out the church, right, during that time was a man by the name of Peter. And Peter had a commission, right, a calling, a vocation on his life, if you will. And when you read the story, there's a story whereby he was, you know, he saw a vision and had to, he was instructed to rise up and eat the animals, kill the animals, eat the animals. And he was just like, no, that's unclean. That's not part of my tradition. That's not part of my heritage. That's not what we do within, our, or within our practices. And what happened was, you know, God told him, listen, do not call what I have made clean unclean. And as we read the story, he goes on and he ushers in this revival, if you will, to a household that was not anything like him. And it was with him in which, Catholicism, modern day Christianity was birthed. If you go back and you trace the historical roots of Christianity and Catholicism, there was bias within him, Peter. There was bias within him. And if you look at it, in terms of like, how do you stop it, right? How do you every movement, every revival, every renaissance, always it starts with, as Nicole mentioned, repentance. And it always starts with individuals. And then individuals are like, man, I'm feeling like this. How do you feel? Man, I'm feeling the same way. Man, what do you think about this? Man, I'm feeling the same way. It always goes back to the individual. It always goes back to self-reflection and repentance, this turning, if you will. And we're talking about trees and planting and roots. When is the best time to plant seeds? When the soil is fertile. That's the best time. And right now, within this country, in this conversation, the soil is fertile and it's uncomfortable. As Christine mentioned earlier, it's uncomfortable, but that's a great thing. That's an excellent thing. And I am not trying to marginalize any of the Black experience. As I look at this and I go through my head, I'm like, man, if you look at it, in the beginning, there was this present life through the Black experience. We die. Don't say nothing so that we don't die, so that we can continue to live, right? And then it was this progression to a preservation of rights. Hey, we're free. We got rights now. You know what I'm saying? Like, let's keep those rights. Let's keep this thing going. Peaceful protests. Let's get through this Jim Crow thing. Let's get through all this. It was like this preservation of rights. And now I believe we're in the stage where there is a preservation of responsibility that we have. We have to preserve the responsibility that we have, because guess what? As Renee said earlier, there is a generation that they're highly intelligent. They are biracial. They are Black, they are brown, they are white, they are everything in between. And they're watching us. The soil is fertile, and it's our responsibility to preserve a preservation of responsibility. And in that, I don't know if you guys can see me, but I'm shaking right now as I'm talking to you. In that responsibility, we have to act. We have to act. Do something. Do something. If you don't know what to do, ask. Ask. But while you're waiting to figure out what it is that you're trying to do, be listening as you're going, because now we have to preserve this window of time. I don't know how long this is going to be. We don't know. We have to preserve this, because now it's this responsibility that we have. And the more people that take responsibility and act during this time, that's when you see the change. That's when you see things get flipped upside down. And that is where I believe that we are right now as a country.
Church.
Hallelujah. I just want to make one last comment, Renee, before you wrap us up, because I know you want to. I'm going to take this on a global scale too. The world is watching. Mm-hmm. And I think that is also something the United States have built itself on, is that it has built itself on this, we are the nation of democracy, and we want to go out there and we're going to proselytize to everyone how democratic we are and how democracy should ring true in every part of the world.
Mm-hmm.
There's a recent article about 6 months ago, it was written, that talked about some of the best nations are the most diverse nations.
Mm-hmm.
And not just diverse, but inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
Where is that in the United States? We don't feel, Black people are not feeling included.
Mm-hmm.
Brown people are not feeling included. LGBTQIA plus people are not feeling included. How can you preach that you are a nation built on democracy and continue to do so when you don't have your own citizens feel like they're included, their rights are being trampled on?
Right.
That to me is what people need to start looking at how and when can you do the work. The time is now. Replant those seeds.
Mm-hmm.
Because as Josiah said, the soil is fertile.
Mm-hmm. So
yes. And Mike, another thing, I know you were saying like the list, like what can people do? When Josiah was talking and he was talking about how like Peter was filling, and then literally was person at a time. I think one thing that people can do, even if you don't know what you should do, is get around other anti-racists and people who are trying to live out that life. Like, even if you don't like social media, even if you don't know a person, you could find someone who has posted something that says, I'm about this work. And whoever's watching this, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There are 7 of us on this call, and that it's like, I don't know what to do, but I know that you're talking about it, So I think like it's super simple, but find someone who is doing it, who is vocal about it, someone who's saying it, link up with them and say, I want to do this too. I don't know what I'm doing or how to do it, but I want to. And so I think that's the other part of it, is community. Find yourself a community, a person that is talking about it. And people don't have to be experts. And I think that's the other part, is like, you don't have to know. I mean, we don't know everything. We have our personal experience and what we have looked at and read and engaged with. But like, that's the beauty of having community, is that you don't have to know everything, but you have to know enough that you bring something. So like, you can't count yourself out and be like, oh, well, they got to figure it out. I'll just kind of be on my way with them. But like, you have to know, like, I don't know everything, but I bring something to the table. But I also know this is not just a one-person job. I've got to connect with other people so that there is a strength that is.
And sometimes that one thing you're bringing is your white privilege.
And you have to be able to spend that privilege. Which
right.
You want to spend it. You want to be with people that can show you how to spend it. I was just thinking, I feel like I'm finishing this call. I feel like we actually road mapped it way more than we maybe thought we did. Like, we talked about personal responsibility and personal repentance. We talked about corporate responsibility, corporate action. We talked about the importance of community. I mean, those are, I think, all the actual pieces that are necessary. And this is beautiful to me. Like, that I feel like was actually a collective plan of action that people can hopefully, be equipped with.
Well, and I think each one of us can share personal stories of when we've seen that in action. When have we seen somebody utilize their privilege for the purposes of anti-racism? I watched my aunt do it one time when we were in the grocery store, and my cousin was in line behind her, and she wrote a check, and they just, oh yeah, everything's fine, and she paid for her groceries. Then my cousin wrote a check, and they got out the register, checked the books to make sure that she hadn't bounced any checks. And my aunt immediately turned around and said, why is it that you're checking her check and you didn't check mine? That was her exercising her white privilege for the purposes of anti-racism. She spoke up. She said something. She noticed it happening, and she said something. So that's an easy practical, like, you know, Mike's like, I need something practical. Give me a practical step. That's a practical thing you can do. When you see it, call it out. And the same thing on our side. You know, when someone comes to you and says, hey, I have a question about your hair, or I want to understand, don't jump down their throat. This is your opportunity to educate. They are asking, they want to know.
I will say that they can ask the question, just don't touch the hair though. That's just a tip for anybody out there.
Don't touch the hair.
Ask the question.
Don't touch the hair.
But don't touch the hair.
Listen,
I'm trying to help you out. I'm trying to help you.
Sorry about that.
Gonna walk around playing Solange for them.
Right.
Don't touch my hair.
But yes, ask the questions, but just don't.
Yes,
Personal space. There we go.
Thank you guys for your input. Actually, that really helps, especially the last example. So thank you. Yeah.
Well, look, I could talk, well, not even talk, I could listen to you all day. I feel like you have provided a compassionate and empathetic, just a beautiful conversation that means something. And so I want to say thank you. You did create a roadmap. You have called people to personal and collective accountability. You know, there are so many corporations who say, yes, we are for diversity and inclusion. And like Earl said, well, then why is everybody in leadership the same gender, the same color, the same? You have to look at those things. You have to look at those things. Are we saying you need to fire people up there? No, not unless they're doing a crummy job. They shouldn't, their role should not be perpetuated if they're not doing anything. But your next hire needs to include everybody, because there are qualified people who are women, who are Black, who are part of diverse communities, right? That may not be yours.
And you need to say that again, Renee, for the people in the back. They are qualified.
That's right. That's right.
Qualified.
They are qualified. That is right. That is right. And so look, if we have to look at resumes and block out the names, no pun intended, and block out the names, so you don't have any prerequisite. Austin Channing Brown, who has come up 3 times now in this conversation, thanks to me, reading her book right now. Her parents gave her the name Austin Channing Brown so she could at least make it to the interview. They gave her a white man's name so she could make it to the interview, all right? So privilege is what you're born with, but legacy is what you create through consistent behavior. All right, use your privilege all you want to do what you want, but what kind of legacy do you want? And that, I believe, is what you have helped create. And to the people who are watching, to the people who sent in questions, I will say right now to the panelists, you have answered them. And for the people who are watching, and I hope more so than watching, you're listening. I hope you recognize that I want to say thank you for taking the first step, if this is the first step. And so now what's next? What are you going to do? Because if it's just pausing this video or sharing it on Facebook, fine, go ahead. But what are you going to do? So thank you so much to Nicole Cottrell, to Mike Barnet, to Christine Anderson, to Dr. Josiah Igono, whose birthday is today. Happy birthday. To Candice Tolliver and the future Dr. Earl Lee, thank you so much. And on behalf of culturallyintelligent.com, I say thank you. And if you want more resources, you can ask anybody, but you can also go there. Thanks so much.